isn't it great to be at our campfire here at Camp Lull tonight? What a beautiful journey we had up from the Great Salt Lake area, up from the Great Salt Lake Valley. For us today on the freeway, it was about a 5-hour drive, but please imagine what it was like 120 years ago. It was a journey of many days. And those who came here were truly pioneers. They came here to harvest the forest, to run their cattle and sheep in the mountains, to mine the hills, to set up towns and build their ranches and farms. They came for opportunity. They gave up many of the luxuries of life for these advantages. In fact, they gave up many of the things that we would call necessities of life. But probably nothing was missed more than a doctor. Someone who knew what to do when someone was injured or ill. There were those who suffered. There were those who died that might have lived had just someone known what to do. Among those who died was a young boy, not much different in age than some of you, and not much different than the many children who died in those days of diseases we don't even think about now. Not much different except in that he had a friend by the name of Jimmy White. And as Jimmy stood by the side of his best friend's grave and watched that little coffin lowered down into that narrow trench, he gathered up along with the family each a handful of earth. And then they threw them down on the coffin top. And as Jimmy cast his handful of dirt onto the coffin top, he made an oath. He swore in his heart that never again, if he had anything to do with it, would anyone have to die just because nobody knew what to do. He swore he would become a doctor. He swore he would become the doctor for the Upper Snake River Valley. He went to work very hard in his elementary school and then on to junior high. And when he went to high school, it was to a big private school down in Salt Lake City, Utah. And from there, it was back east to university and then graduate school, medical school, internship, and little Jimmy White became Dr. White. He could have stayed back east and made a fortune. You know, California was just opening up like a blooming rose. It beckoned. But even as he remembered the sound of those earthen clods striking the boards above his best friend's face, he remembered that promise which he had made, that oath which he had sworn, and he returned to the Upper Snake River Valley. You know, it wasn't long before Dr. White was the most valued citizen in all the community. You see, it didn't matter the season of the year, what the weather was, the time of day or night. If you could get word to Dr. White that you needed his help, he would be on his way. At first in a big buggy drawn by a horse. But when automobiles became dependable, you can bet that one of the very first in the whole valley was Dr. White's big car. It had great big wooden spoke wheels, big knobby tires that would pull him up into the lumber camps, up into the cattlemen's ranches, and up into the sheep herders' camps as well. And then when telephones came into use, oh, that was a blessing. You can bet that one of the first telephone lines, and you know, in those days, no line, no phone, one of the first telephone lines ran to Dr. White's home and office. Now, as I said, many of us are from out of Great Salt Lake area, and there along the Great Basin, we know how the storms come. They kind of pop up over the promontories or up over the Ochre Mountains and then smack into the Wasatch Range and the storms come down. But it's not the same here, not up in the Upper Snake. The storms slide in slowly, for there are no mountains to the west. They come up clear across the horizon, out from the way of the sea, and they pile up against the Teton Range and against the pitched stone plateau of Yellowstone. They thicken, and then when they're dark and clouds are heavy, there's flash of lightning and the roll of thunder, and then comes down the rain and the hail in a roar and a crash. It was just such a night. Just to dark, the storm had hit, And in the midst of the roar and crash of that great storm, Dr. White's telephone rang. He picked it up, and over it a voice came pleading, "Help me! Help me, please! Help me!" And then in the same tortured tones, he was given instructions of how to come to a house high in the mountains, and then the line went dead. Dr. White turned to look out the window, and just at that instant, in a flash of lightning, he could see the wind-driven rain flowing down the window pane in a sheet. And yet out in that storm, someone needed his help. He was a doctor. He was the doctor. He knew he had to go. He put on his hat and coat, pulled on his boots, scraped whatever he thought he might need into his satchel, and flashlight in hand, he headed out into the dark. Soon the only light to be seen all up and down the valley were the headlights of that old car headed up the gravel highway. At last he came, as he had been told he would, to where the last barbed wire fence ran down, separating the cultivated pastures and fields of the valley from the sagebrush scrub of the foothill. And on the far side of that fence, as he had been promised, a little two-rut lane leading off into the mountains, and down it he turned. It was greasy, slick with mud. Many times he was nearly stuck, but those big knobby tires caught and pulled him on, up out of the hills, and he approached the forest wall. And that road dove into the forest like a tunnel into a mountainside. But Dr. White knew into that darkness he had to go. He was the doctor. He drove deep into the trees. It was so dark, and the crashing rain seemed to dim his headlight beams. Oh yeah, every now and then there was a flash of lightning, and for less than a second it would be brighter than day. But then the dark would close in deeper, more intense than before. As he fought his way up the road, he marveled at its condition. How could anyone live up a road so untended, he thought. Every now and then he would come to where a great branch, a limb of a tree had fallen into the road, or even a tire young tree had broken off. He would have to get out into the storm and wrestle them aside, and yet on he fought. And at length, as he had been promised, the road came up out of the trees, and there he faced a great treeless south-facing slope, and high up on the side above the road, just as it had been explained to him, he saw a little house, not much more than a shack. Now he could see no drive or walkway leading to it, so he parked the car directly below it. He left the headlights on, the engine running, and he started up the hillside. He fell many times. His hands were sore and bruised, his clothing covered with grit, when at last he stepped up onto the porch. And as he did so, his heart sank into his stomach. You see, the windows were boarded shut, and the door looked like it hadn't been opened in years. It was then that it came to him, that thought that had been cankering there in the back of his brain. How could anyone telephone me from up here? Why, there might not be 10 telephones in the entire valley. How could anyone get me out in a night like this on a prank? The tears welled up in his eyes, the lump in his throat, his chest ached. He turned to leave. How could they do it? It was almost as an afterthought that he grabbed the doorknob and twisted it. To his surprise, it turned with ease, and the door swung inward. He stepped to that black gap, and he shined his flashlight about the room. Nothing but dust, dust that carpeted the floor, dust that stood an inch deep in the window sills. How could they do it? Once again he turned to leave. It was then that he saw it. It might have been in a flash of lightning that illuminated the room like day, or it might have been in the last sweep of his flashlight beam. But there, clearly etched in the dust of the floor, as if someone had lifted it from below and then let it drop back into place, the outline of a trapdoor, obviously recently disturbed. Perhaps Perhaps someone was under the house, thought Dr. White. He'd come this far. He was a doctor, the doctor. He ought to go on. He made his way across the floor, muffled steps in the dust. He felt about in the deep dust until he found the ring that was the handle to that trapdoor, and he threw it open, and there, opening up into the mountain beneath the house, a staircase leading down into the dark. He slid the flashlight into the satchel hand and reached for the handrail. It felt odd to his touch, and so he shined the light upon it. And there, carved in the wood at the end of the rail, was the head of a man, an ugly little man, an ugly little green man, all covered with dust. He tried not to think of that monster as he started down the stairs. Down, down, down he went, and soon the roar and crash of that great storm were completely blocked out by the solid stone of the mountain that rose above his head. And then he came to a door, and there, carved in the wood of the door, right at eye level where he had to look at it, was the head of a man, an ugly little man, an ugly little green man, all covered with dust. He pushed the door aside. More stairs leading down, down, down into the mountain. What drew him on now, he did not know. It seemed to be a force without himself. But down and down the stairs he went, deeper and deeper into the mountain's heart. There it was that he noticed it for the first time, ever so faintly at first, where the brightest core of his flashlight beam brushed the dust of the walls or the steps beneath his feet. The dust seemed to take on a green glow of its own. But the deeper he went, it was faint and fading at first. But then it grew more intense and more brilliant the deeper he went, until at last the corridor about him seemed to be filled with ribbons of green and glowing light. And then he came to another door. He reached for the doorknob. There, cast in brass and corroded, was the head of a man, an ugly little man, an ugly little green man, all covered with dust. He took that hateful thing in his hand and twisted it, and the door swung inward, and the light flowed in about him, illuminating a tiny room with green and glowing light. And in the middle of that room there was a desk. And indeed, upon that desk there sat a telephone, and behind the desk a chair, and in that chair there sat a man, an ugly little man, an ugly little green man, all covered with dust, and his head was thrown back, and out of the corner of his mouth there ran a trail of thick red blood. Dr. White came forward. He took the little man ever so gently in his arms, and he shook him, and his head rolled round, and his eyes came open, huge and swollen and shot with blood. Little man, said Dr. White, you can't be here all alone. Someone must care for you, a wife, a child, a friend, a brother, a mother-in-law. The little green man screamed and crumbled into dust, thick green dust all over Dr. White's hands. It was then that he noticed how strangely shriveled and green his own hands were. He turned back for the door, but it wasn't there. He beat on the walls all round, everywhere stone, solid stone. He went back to the desk. He picked up the telephone. He dialed a number, any number. And when they answered, he said, "Help me! Please help me!"